Hello everyone, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. and this particular video is a response to someone who was interacting with me on a Facebook post, and it happened to be a Facebook post that was feeding off of something that was from an LDS source. And sometimes when you get into a Facebook conversation with people, especially with people of a different religion and those kinds of things, some of the conversations are not always all that helpful. People aren't necessarily interested in discussing the issue or discussing the truth of the matter. Instead, some people just get on there because they like to hack at each other and say, "You're wrong, I'm right. You're right. You're wrong, I'm right." Da 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 da. And the conversation really doesn't go anywhere, and there really isn't any productive revelation of what either side believes, any meaningful analysis thereof, or anything like that. But from time to time, I do get people that do sincerely want to interact, at least to the extent that they're able. And in this particular case, there's someone on one of who's been commenting on one of the comments that I made. That I think asked a really good question that's worth responding to in this format. This person's name is Ryan. I'm not going to say the last name because it's not necessary. But this person's name is Ryan, and his response, he was responding to some of the problems that I have with Mormonism that I like to point out, because they are sincere questions that I have for them. I want them to really think about these things and consider the implications, especially as it relates to truth. Does what you believe actually adhere to standards of truth is basically what I'm asking. And I talk about things like consistency, things like ad fontes, going to the sources, multifocality, use of multiple sources, injective falsifiability, those kinds of things. And on one of those posts, he makes this comment. He says, "I heard this same argument at work once about who's true and not true based on the Bible. My question is, how do you know the Bible is true? I'm not trying to argue or prove anything. I'm just curious how you determine that. And if the process is the same for all truth, like what we learn in school or read in books or hear from friends." That is an amazing question. Okay, and I really, really, really love his attitude in this, I gotta say. There's some people who just get flat out nasty, and it doesn't matter if they're Mormon, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, whatever. There's some people that are just downright nasty. But there are people out there who just sincerely want to know, and I think that is this guy's case. I mean, yes, I don't think he's, once he hears my response, he's suddenly going to be say, "Oh, I've seen the light, and I'm not going to be a Mormon anymore." Probably not likely to happen, but he wants there to at least be a conversation. He probably has his own intentions in it. He'd like for me to become a Mormon. That's probably true, just as much as I'd like for him to become a biblical historical Christian. But he's willing to continue the conversation, and because of that willingness, and because I think he asks a good question and a sincere question, that's why I'm taking the time to respond to it in this form. Okay, so what is the question he's asking? He's saying, how do you know the Bible is true? And my basic response in the nutshell version is, well, I've already given you, a lot of reasons in my original post as to why the Bible is true over, say, Mormonism or any other standard that you want to apply it to. I mean, does it coincide with standards of truth that result from absolute truth? Not necessarily to say that they can prove something absolutely. I'll talk about that in a second. But they do coincide with it. That is, if something really happened in history, you would expect it to leave a historical record. And that record is going to be your best bet at getting back to the history. That's where the standard of ad fontes comes from. Looking at the sources and evaluating them. And of course, using as many sources as possible, multifocality, and contrasting them and figuring out what's really going on. And of course, multifocality, to a certain extent, always includes a certain amount of evaluation, because you're going to get multiple sources saying multiple things, and they can't all be right. So evaluation is going to be part of that. And one of the standards of evaluation is always going to be consistency. And consistency doesn't necessarily mean that they say the exact same thing all the time. The consistency means, is, Is there a basis from one thing to another? Are they logically consistent? Can they hold together in the same universe, or logically does it fall apart? Things like that. And those would be a lot of the basic evidences that I would talk about in talking about, why is the Bible true? And these are standards that would be applied across the board. That is, if you go to, a history class and you study history, you're going to learn from historical sources. Now, I don't agree with the way that modern history is done to a large extent, because right now it's basically look at the sources and then come up with your own interpretation instead of allowing the ancient authors to speak for themselves. It's basically become a premise of saying the ancient people were idiots and we know what was really going on, and so we're going to basically interpret it for them. Got this one rooster hair that's sticking up for some weird reason, and I'll worry about that later. Anyways, I don't agree with that modern take on it, that you can basically ignore what the historical sources had to say after you've read them. Oh yeah, I read him, but I think he was wrong because this, that, and the other thing. And a lot of times it's not even because of, it's just ancient people were dumb and we're so smart now, which is really antagonistic way to read history in general. And when it comes to religious works, whether it be the Quran or the Vedas or any work that you want to talk about, assuming that the author was an idiot is not going to be particularly helpful nor particularly respectful. Okay, so but there's still that standard of going to the sources and saying what actually was taught then. And so, in Mormonism, when you talk about what did early Christians believe, that they believe in, the principle of eternal marriage, that they believe in Aaronic versus Melchizedek priesthood, and these kinds of things, you can go to early Christian sources. The Bible would comprise the primary set of those, but there are many other early Christian sources as well, and frankly, they're completely void of those beliefs. You're not going to find early sources talking about eternal marriage and Melchizedek priesthood and things like that, not in those terms that Mormons would use at all. It's not there. It's completely absent. You're not going to talk about them preaching on the plurality of gods as being a positive thing. It's not there. The principle of exaltation, you do find what is called theosis in early Christian sources, but the principle of theosis and exaltation is not at all the same. Theosis is the principle of being subsumed in God's divine character. It is not becoming a God yourself. It is becoming, in a basic sense, what God wants you to be, not becoming an exalted member of the species, which is more so what Mormons teach. And there's a lot of finesse, fine details you could get in there, and I'm not saying that I'm giving a complete discourse on Mormon theology here. That's not my point. I'm a Christian. I'm going to defend that part of it. But you're not going to find anything that's even remotely close to Mormonism in the early sources. So Ad Fontes, it fails it. That's what things like that are reasons why I would talk about the Book of Mormon, saying it doesn't jive with what it claims the history was. When it talks about what these early groups were teaching, it doesn't correspond, but I'm talking actually more about Mormonism in general. Mormonism as a whole doesn't jive with what the early sources of Christianity say that early Christians believed, so on and so forth. Not just the Book of Mormon, that's really specific. In the Book of Mormon, there's actually a lot of things I don't disagree with in the Book of Mormon. I actually agree more with the Book of Mormon than I would say the Doctrine and Covenants or the Pearl of Great Price, or a lot of the specific sermons that you find in the Journal of Discourses and things like that. Book of Mormon is much less objectionable to me as a Christian than all those other sources, but it's part of the package deal of Mormonism as a whole. And the same thing I would apply for a lot of other groups. That is, when they talk about what happened in history, that is, do the historical sources coincide with what they say? And if they make a claim about what a particular group believes or didn't believe, how accurate are their claims? Take the Quran, for example. Does it adhere to the principle of Ad Fontes? If I look up what ancient Jews and Christians believe compared to what the Quran says that they believed, am I going to find that it shows a good knowledge of that or not? Well, no. When the Quran talks about the doctrine of the Trinity, for example, and remember the Quran is written 7th century. Well, it's not actually written, it's recited 7th century, and then it's written down later. Not terribly later. Okay, don't confuse what I'm saying. But it is written down later, and it is at first recited, and it does describe, or at least takes a shot at trying to describe what we Christians believe about God, about the Trinity. And whenever it goes against the Trinity, because it denies it, it is of course implying that this is what Allah originally never taught. And when you study early Christianity, that wasn't their take on it at all. I mean, even Barsamia, who was contemporaneous with the Apostle John, when he is taken in under threat of execution, he winds up not being executed, which is nice, but under threat of execution, and he starts talking about his God. He starts talking about the God who is three persons that's worshipped as one, specifically one being. You get the doctrine of the Trinity at the earliest stages of Christian history. Is it laid out as being the Trinity and using that kind of terminology? No, but the idea that you have three persons who are subsumed in, who subsist, I should say, in one being, that's there from the very beginning. And that was very, very, very well established in Christian history. And of course, there are places in Christian history where people would argue against it and come up against it. And Islam was just one of the ones along the line that didn't like that doctrine. And when Islam responded to the doctrine of Trinity, they had a really bad idea of what the Trinity was. For them, if you look at what the Quran says about the Trinity, it associates God, Mary, and Jesus. That's not the Trinity. Now, if you talk with some Catholics who hold to the Marian dogmas, okay, they come a little close, but I'm not Catholic, by the way, so I can make that joke. What they hold to as far as Marian dogmas, they have nothing to do with the historical beliefs at all. But in the Quran, it associates the Trinity as being Father, Mary, Jesus. And of course, it keeps saying, don't say three, don't say three, don't say three. Well, Trinitarianism isn't actually threeness. It's 3 in 1. And the Quran never gets that formula right. The earliest Christian sources that you have, even though they don't necessarily come out and say Trinity, still get the basic description right. You have three persons who are being worshipped as one. 3 in 1. You get that from the beginning. And you get sameness of being, distinction of person, even in the New Testament, which is something that Mormons kind of struggle with to a great extent, because they can see the distinction of person real easily. You have Jesus praying to the Father, and for some reason they think that the Trinity is that the Father and Jesus are the same, and they're not. They're different persons. That's very clear and evident from the text. But they are being worshipped as one being, and they're being associated with each other as one being. And that could be a whole long discussion. I don't want to get into all that right here because it's just not on the topic. The topic is why the Bible is true. And I'm going the comparative route right now, talking about other religions. And like I said, Quran, when I apply the standard of ad fontes of looking at the sources about what it says about other groups, it gets it wrong. That is, it doesn't actually jive with the historical facts. And then, of course, people come in and could say, well, those historical facts were corrupted, they were changed, and all those kinds of things. And, well, there was this one little group over here that believed something that was kind of close to that, and that's what they were really talking about. And you could go on with those kind of possibilities all day long. Well, this is possible, and this is possible, and this is possible, and it's possible that we're all really just Martians. Bill Nye believes that, which is strange. And those kinds of things. But the question at the end of the day is that really reasonable given the evidence that you have? That's the system of jurisprudence that the Western world generally has, is that when you're proving something, you don't prove it beyond all possible doubt, you prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. Anything is possible, but not everything is reasonable. Is it reasonable to believe that this particular kind of record could have been left about a certain people from a multitude of sources, and yet the reality be completely different than that? Possible? Maybe. Reasonable? Definitely not. Things like that. When I take a look at these groups and actually say, what do they say about history? Does it jive? Does it not? What kind of understanding does it show? And the Bible, when it talks about these historical events and it talks about what's going on, you see a comparison with what the early Christians believe versus what the Bible talks about. There's a correspondence between them. Lots of reinforcement between them, which is fantastic and amazing. But with a lot of other groups, you don't see that kind of consistency. Add font this, go into sources, just doesn't work. Okay, but like I said, those are all external kinds of proofs. That is, and a lot of people do this when they talk about Scripture in general, especially the Bible. When they want to prove it, they'll talk about things like fulfilled prophecy. They do that with Nostradamus too. Does that mean that I accept Nostradamus as a prophet? No. Does it mean that I would accept what he wrote as being Scripture? No. And that's kind of the problem when you have a lot of these kinds of proofs. What you have in history, recorded, what you can observe in the present through like an experiment or something that you could do, those actually all have their limitations. They don't actually prove things in the absolute sense. Now, they might be based on principles that coincide with absolute truth, but in and of themselves, they don't guarantee it usually. And that's a problem that you have. It's really easy using experiments and those kinds of things, provided you accept certain things about observation and your ability to observe. You can disprove things pretty easily. If somebody made the claim that oxygen and hydrogen will never react with each other. I mean, all you have to do is just fill a room with the stuff and then light a spark, and it's going to react. You can prove them wrong real easy. Proving that a given claim is right, though, in a universal sense, that it's always true, is very, very, very difficult. And this is why in science, what you get are, scientific laws and theories that are never actually absolute. Instead, there's always that possibility that somebody could come across some evidence that is against it, in which case you have to change the theory, adjust the model. We had, Newtonian physics, then we get, the theories general and special relativity that kind of throw a monkey wrench into things, and you have to change. You realize that that wasn't actually right. It might have been good in a lot of cases, but it's not all. It's not universal. And that is the problem with evidence. You can have an infinite amount of evidence and still be wrong about something. For example, here's a simple claim. Somebody might claim that there's no such thing as the North Pole. And they could take out a globe, a model of the Earth, and say, here, let me show you what I'm talking about. And they go to the equator, and they point to a place on the equator and say, that's not the North Pole. They turn the globe a little bit and say, that's not the North Pole. They keep turning it, and they keep turning it, and they keep turning it, and going up and down a little bit around the equator. And they're actually going to technically be able to find an infinite number of places there that are not the North Pole. Infinite amount of evidence. Does that mean that there's no North Pole? No. Somebody could come along, point to the top of the globe, and say, it's right there, dummy. Prove them wrong with one point of evidence, right? Infinite amount of confirming evidence doesn't prove a thing. One bit of disconfirming evidence, though, shatters it all. So if you want to say that something is absolutely true, not just that there's good evidence that something is true, but that it indicates that something is true, but you actually want to say that it's absolute, you go into a very different realm of proof. And this is where I get into my field. I was trained as a mathematician. That's what I originally went to college for, was to be a math teacher. And absolute truth is something that math has, whereas other fields do not have it. That is, math is entirely self-contained, and it is absolute. Now, when people come up with, not scientists, but mathematicians, that's an insult to mathematicians everywhere to call them scientists. But when mathematicians prove something mathematically, now they might, create a physical situation that they could go and, kind of confirm it by, but it's not true because you can do this physical thing with it. Now, there are cases where, there have been physical problems that have resulted in mathematic formulas being created and vice versa, actually. But the math isn't true because it's confirmed externally. Math is actually self-contained. Now, because it is self-contained and absolutely true, it's going to match what's out here. But that just simply confirms it. It doesn't actually make it true. It's true in and of itself. And when you do math, what you're basically doing is you're taking the laws of logic and you're applying them to particular definitions. That's essentially what mathematics is at its most basic sense. And you take these laws of logic, you apply it to this set of definitions, and you figure out how they relate to each other. And those relations how things relate to each other based on the laws of logic are basically what wind up creating your formulas and your theorems and all those kinds of things. But there's an interesting phenomena that happens. You can have all these theorems down here that have been proved, and you say, okay, what was the basis for them? And you get to the next level up here, how did that get proved, so on and so forth. But eventually you get to the axiomatic realm. Axioms are really interesting. All of these other things here that are down here, all the other theorems down here in the not postulates, but the theorems down here and all the lemmas and all those kinds of things, those things are proved. Eventually, though, you get back to a point where there is no proof that can be offered. It's axiomatic. And that is one of the basic definitions of an axiom, is that it's something for which no proof is offered. And more specifically, something for which no proof can be offered. So how do you know that the axiom is valid? Well, there's lots of different things that would indicate that out in reality. That is, that if you don't have these axioms, you don't have any useful results, which means you wind up knowing nothing. You get basically a profound agnosticism. And unless you believe that that is really the case, that there's nothing to be known, in which case, math is arbitrary, science is arbitrary, everything is arbitrary, and there is no absolute whatsoever. If you are willing to accept that, then you basically wind up with nothingness. There's no reason to believe anything because you couldn't prove anything. And that's one of the basic assumptions that is made in math, is that knowledge does exist, that logic does exist, so on and so forth. It has to be true in order for a meaningful system of knowledge to result. Knowledge has to exist for knowledge to be the result of any kind of investigation. It has to be there. Okay, and that is an axiomatic basis. You can't prove that knowledge exists. How do you know you're in your own brain that what you think you know, you actually know? Especially if you take on a naturalistic, materialistic worldview of things. I mean, you'd just be basically a bag of chemicals that are reacting within you, and who knows if they're right or wrong as to what they think is true or not. No, you have to make an assumption there. You have to have an axiom that says no, truth is meaningful. So how does that relate to knowing if the Bible is true or not? We've talked about some of the evidential things, like looking in history ad frontis and those kinds of things. But one of the things that I find interesting about the God of the Bible that you do not find with other gods of other religions is that he actually defines himself axiomatically. Now, he does give evidence of himself. He does indicate his power in many places throughout the Bible. When Moses goes and presents himself to the people and says, hey, I'm going to lead you guys out of Egypt, before Pharaoh, one of the signs that he's given is, the ability to turn the rod into a serpent and those kinds of things. Well, actually, he keeps pointing over to Aaron and saying, okay, Aaron, do your thing with the rod. But that is a sign that is given. It indicates truth. However, it doesn't prove it in the absolute. And like I said, in absolute proofs, all the stuff down here can be proven absolutely, but it's based on prior things being there that are absolutely true, but you cannot prove them. They're called axioms. And in mathematics and in any formally absolute field, you have to assume the presence of axioms is accepted. And there are groups that will try to question them. For example, the principle of the excluded middle, that something is either true or not true. It can't be both at the same time, or some kind of mixture of them. There are people who have tried to reject that, and they don't really produce any great results, and they certainly don't produce any great results that haven't already been produced. That is, if you assume that you don't know something, guess what happens? You don't know something. That's the result. You put nothing in, you get nothing out. So if you take away part of what you're starting with, what you get out is going to proportionally have that hole in it as well. It's a deconstructivism, taking away from what you know. It's a profound agnosticism, saying you can't know something. And every time you say, well, I'm not absolutely sure about something, I don't know if I can be sure about this, you wind up destroying everything that follows from that. And this is the problem that I've seen a lot of my Mormon friends have, is, they start questioning everything down to the point where basically they say, well, I can't really be sure of any standard of truth, so, I'm going to basically create a standard for myself, is what it boils down to, and whenever somebody mentions any kind of standard of absolute truth, I'm going to slip into that realm of profound agnosticism and say, well, how do we really know? How do we really know that this is the case? It's a very common thing now. I get that. I understand that. But if you want to have a system of absolute truth, you can't do that. You can't deny a basis for knowledge and expect knowledge to result. It just doesn't happen. And like I said, the God of the Bible is the only God that I'm aware of that describes himself in this fashion. There are lots of gods that describe themselves as eternal. The God of Mormonism is an eternal God, for example. Not that he's always been God, but that he's always existed at least as an intelligence. Who was born, became a man, progressed through the process of exaltation, eventually became God, so on and so forth. But he eternally existed at least as an intelligence. Okay. And there are lots of gods that do actually claim to be eternal. Allah, the god of the Islamic religion, is in the same way, claims to be eternal. But the God of the Bible is unique in that not only does he sometimes give indicative proof that indicates that he's true, it doesn't necessarily prove in the absolute stuff, but it indicates that he's true. He gives evidence like that, but he also, through the revelation of his word and even through a lot of his direct statements, makes it very clear that that isn't all there is to it. He makes statements of an axiomatic existence for himself. In fact, his very name that he calls himself is that kind of a name. When he introduces himself to Moses, and Moses, asks the question, well, who should I say is sending me? And he says, I am that I am. And then he later on reveals his name as Yahweh. In a lot of English translations, it's translated as the Lord, and the Lord is usually in uppercase letters. It's in caps. That's a translation of the Hebrew word Yahweh, and it's actually taken from the verb to be. And it literally means the one who is, the one that you basically cannot get behind. He's the axiom. Okay, he describes himself as the absolute standard of truth. He does not, yes, he does, give indicative proofs, but in addition to that, he comes out and says, I am the basis for this. And this is why I say in Proverbs, in the book of Proverbs, chapter 1, verse 7, when the proverbist is talking about gaining wisdom and knowledge, he starts out by saying that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom and knowledge. That is, accepting God as your axiom, and the God of the Bible, the God of that revelation, is going to be the basis for everything else that follows. These things you can prove on this axiom. That doesn't mean that you can prove the axiom, though. It doesn't mean that you can prove that revelation, but it means that everything else is going to follow from that. And this is generally what I find to be the case. This is how God describes himself in an axiomatic fashion, whereas other gods don't do that, and they can't do that, quite frankly, especially the God of Mormonism. He can't do that. Okay, because the God of Mormonism is a part of the cosmos. He's a part of existence as a whole. He's not in control of everything. He has his realm that he's in control, but he's not in control of everything everywhere at all times. He's not axiomatic to the system as a whole. That is, the law of progression existed before Elohim, the God of Mormonism, existed, and long before he existed, and will continue to exist thereafter, independent of him. And the same, I think, goes for the laws of matter and those kinds of things, because usually there's assumption either that there were previous universes, or at least other worlds, etc., etc. However you want to qualify that, and Mormons are a little bit nebulous on that one right now. Whether they're talking about worlds within a universe or they're talking about multiverses and those kinds of things, it gets really nebulous really quick, especially if you study it in history. But the God of the Bible isn't like that. He is the axiom behind everything else. The one thing that you can't get behind, yes, you can have all these indications down here that he's true, but ultimately, he himself is the thing that you cannot prove. And that's how he identifies himself. The idea of formally and rigorously going through and having axiomatic bases and these kinds of things, it's a very modern thing. But what's weird is that the God of the Bible started out by basically introducing himself that way. I am Yahweh. I am the one who is. There is nothing before. There is no prior proof. I am the axiom. When he describes himself, say in the book of Isaiah, or when Christ describes himself in the book of Revelation as the first and last, that's what he means. It means everything that you have, all knowledge, is based on me. And that's why in the book of Proverbs it says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. It doesn't say that it's the end. It doesn't say that you can't know anything without knowing God. It just simply means that if you do know anything, it's because God exists in the first place. And this is one of the conversations that I love to have with my atheist friends. They say, prove, that God exists and those kinds of things. And you can't really prove that God exists in that sense because, like I said, the God of the Bible is an axiomatic God. But what you can do is you can say, well, what do you think you know? Well, and sometimes they take it the wrong way and they start talking about what they think they know about God or how he is, and that's not what I mean. I mean, what do you think you know? What you know, if you're an atheist, and most atheists are naturalistic materialists, if you're a naturalistic materialist, you are basically a bag of goo that's having a bunch of chemical reactions go on it. If you think you know something, it's because of chemical happenstance. And who knows if those chemicals happen to be firing right? How do you know if what you think is a standard of truth is actually a standard of truth? If there isn't a basis for knowledge prior to that is outside of the naturalistic materialistic realm, what you think is true is completely pointless. And no matter how many people you get to agree with you is going to be completely pointless, because that's the vote of, a bunch of bags of goo. And one bag of goo, a bunch of bags of goo that happen to agree on this point or happen to disagree on this point isn't going to matter. That's not an absolute proof. So does that show that there is a God absolutely in and of itself? No, but it does indicate the necessity of that axiomatic basis, something that exists independent and prior to everything else. And so when it comes back down to that question of how do I know the Bible is true? Well, like I said, there are standards that you could apply to everything else. Christians do believe, biblical historical Christians, I need to be a little bit more specific because, like I said, I'm not Catholic or Eastern Orthodox. Okay, biblical historical Christians do believe that the standards of truth are going to be consistent across the walks of life. And the reason why we believe that all of the individual standards of truth that we could talk about in the here and now being true is because they have one ultimate source. They have an axiomatic basis. All of these individual standards of truth that you could talk about have an axiomatic basis that is necessary to them all, and that axiomatic basis is God. That is, God literally defines truth. God defines love. In the Bible, when it says God is love, that's part of what it's talking about. It's part of a much larger complex in the Bible as to what God is, and it's usually what God is the basis of. It describes things in an axiomatic way. Axiomatic thinking is actually part of the biblical historical worldview. It comes from us. And that's the thinking that created all of the theorems in mathematics that we have and all those kinds of things. All those things in high school that you learned that you didn't really want to learn. Yeah, that's because basically of Christianity in a long roundabout way. But the history of math is another issue and another bit of an issue. But getting back to the main point, and I know I've gone on for a long time, and Ryan, if you listen to all this, I really do appreciate it because I know I ramble all the time. It probably would have been better for me to type it out. But the answer to your question is basically this. There are axiomatic truth results in resultant truths, and you can apply those resultant truths to indicate that something is true, but the absolute proof, of course, ultimately is going to come back to an axiom, an axiom you cannot prove. So when you say, why is the Bible true? How do you know it's true? Well, I can give you all of these individual lines of evidence that you're not going to find in other religions. Ad fontes, is it really consistent with what it claims about history and those kinds of things? And those indicate, but they don't prove in the absolute sense. Instead, I would say that ultimately what sets Christianity apart and the Bible of Christianity, and there's actually a little bit more that you could talk about as far as what the Bible is versus canonical scripture, because they're technically not actually the same thing. But in basic terms, why I would trust the Bible, why I would say that it is true, is like I said, yeah, there's indications that it is, but ultimately is because of the God that it speaks of relative to the God that other groups speak of. It is the one that describes its God in axiomatic terms. And because of that, it's the only one that you could rightly use as a basis for absolute truth. Without that, without a God who puts himself in absolute terms like that as an axiomatic basis, an absolute axiomatic basis for everything else, you don't have a God who is absolutely true. You have gods who are probably true based either on an individual testimony, and I do not say that lightly. I know that a lot of Mormons who have an individual testimony are very sincere about it, just like a lot of people that I know who have testimonies that, living with your girlfriend is okay, and sleeping with her is okay because you prayed about it and you received a testimony that was good. I know lots of people that are sincere like that. And that doesn't make them right, though, of course. And please understand, I'm not saying that flippantly. I understand the sincerity in that, I really do, but it's just not a consistently reliable standard of truth. But ultimately, why I trust the Bible is because it is the only one whose God could, within itself, within its own self, ever be a basis for absolute truth. Like I said, the God of Mormonism is a part of the cosmos, a part of all existent things. He is not the basis for all existent things. And even in the Quran, as far as I know, when it describes God, yes, it describes him as eternal and all-powerful and these kinds of things, but it doesn't describe him axiomatically, at least not that I've been able to see, and maybe some of my Muslim friends can comment on this and maybe figure out where it is in the Quran for me, or in the Hadith, or whatever it might be, but I haven't seen it. I haven't seen where he is defined in axiomatic terms. The only one that I know that is like that is the God of the Bible. And because of that, it is only the God of the Bible who can actually even begin within that system to give you anything that's absolutely true. That is a really, really, really long and complicated explanation because I've talked about indicated truths and ad fontes and multiplicality and those kinds of things. But ultimately, it comes down to that axiomatic basis. There's only one God who ever puts himself in that place, whoever describes himself through his revelation in those terms. And that's the God of the Bible. I am that I am. Yahweh, the Lord. I am. I exist. The self-existent one. The alone self-existent one, if you want to get really picky about it. The beginning. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom and knowledge. The basis for everything else that follows. Which isn't to say that there aren't people who understand who don't. Understand the things that follow. There's plenty of people that do. There's plenty of people that know that 2 plus 2 is 4. The question is whether or not they have an ultimate axiomatic basis for that, etc., etc. Anyways, deep things. Great question, really, really. I do appreciate it, and a lot to think about. Yeah, lots and lots and lots that's there, and time's getting away from me. But anyways, thank you, and like I said, at the beginning of this, I know that you're probably not going to convert from Mormonism just because you heard me rambling and that kind of thing, but hopefully it will at least give you something more to think about. And, at least for the conversation. If nothing else, our conversation will hopefully other people figure out some of the differences between Mormonism and biblical historical Christianity. If nothing else, people learn from it. So either way you look at it, as far as I'm concerned, it's a bonus. If people can look at, different groups interacting with each other, keeping things relatively civil, disagreeing ardently in those places where it's necessary to disagree, because you do disagree, and being honest about that is just fine, but still being civil to the extent where you can say, I understand that you come from a different perspective on that, and I want to understand your perspective, and I want you to understand mine, is a good example for people. So thank you very much, Ryan, for doing that, and for other people on the various posts that I've had who do that. There's some people who don't, and you know who you are. But for those who actually want to honestly engage in a conversation for the good of everyone who's around them and listening, thank you so much. Thank you so much indeed. For those of you who are in Christ, I'm referring to biblical historical Christians. For those of you who are in Christ, may you go with God and be blessed. For those of you who are not, that would include Mormons. For those of you who are not, may you come to an understanding of the true Christ of history, the only genuine Savior of mankind. Amen.